As promised, I am making up for not posting on Thursday by giving you my first deep dive today. And this is one hell of a story to do a deep dive on. On the morning of May 29th, 2021, 7 people climbed aboard a small private jet outside Nashville, Tennessee, carrying enough hairspray, diamonds, and apocalyptic charisma to stock an entire season of the Righteous Gemstones. This was an interesting group of people, a controversial one, but within minutes, they were gone, swallowed by Percy Priest Lake, after the aircraft twisted into a catastrophic plunge that investigators would later attribute to pilot disorientation. Although for former members of the Remnant Fellowship, the crash felt less like an accident and more like the inevitable final chapter of a story that had been hurtling towards disaster for decades. But this was never just the story of a church, and it was never really a story about weight loss either. This is a story about hunger, the kind that lives in people long before they ever open a refrigerator. The hunger to be loved, to be chosen, to be envied at church potlucks by women quietly surviving on Diet Coke and self-hatred while complimenting each other's casserole recipes. The hunger to feel morally superior in a country where thinness has sometimes become tangled up with godliness, patriotism, self-control, and the deeply American belief that suffering beautifully in silence counts as cardio. No one understood that hunger better than Gwen Shamblin. By the late 1990s, Gwen had transformed herself from a Tennessee dietitian into a platinum-haired evangelical celebrity whose weight loss empire generated millions of dollars through books, seminars, workshops, VHS tapes, church programs, and an increasingly devoted following of women who believed God cared very deeply about whether or not they ate a second dinner roll. Then came Remnant Fellowship. And suddenly, the diet guru, who once told followers to pray instead of snack, was no longer merely selling thinness. She was selling obedience. Absolute obedience. The kind that reached into marriages, bedrooms, parenting, bank accounts, punishments, friendships, and eventually into nearly every corner of a person's identity until the church itself became the only approved mirror through which they were allowed to see themselves. There would be allegations of abuse, dead children, families divided beyond repair, ex-members who described psychological control so intense they still lower their voices years later when speaking Gwen's name. And now, years after the plane crash that killed Gwen and several top church leaders, her own son, Michael Shamblin, has begun publicly accusing Remnant of operating more like a cult than a church, claiming members feared retaliation, surveillance, and spiritual destruction if they dared leave. But before the investigations, before the lawsuits, before the lake swallowed the kingdom whole, there was simply a woman with a microphone and an astonishing understanding of American insecurity. Gwen Shamblin looked at the national epidemic of shame-eating, body hatred, evangelical guilt, and suburban loneliness, and realized something that would make her very, very rich. If you can convince people they are inherently evil, they'll hand you their soul for free. This is the story of the starving prophet. I'm your host, Stacy Lee. Let's begin. Long before Gwen Shamblin became the frighteningly thin televangelist with gravity-defying blonde hair and the energy of a Southern megachurch Marie Antoinette who had survived exclusively on Sweet and Low and Divine Revelation, she was simply another ambitious woman growing up in Tennessee. watching America become increasingly obsessed with thinness while pretending the obsession was about health. America has always loved turning ordinary bodily functions into evidence of personal virtue. And by the 1980s, the country had fully merged Christianity, dieting, and feminine worth into one giant aerosol cloud of shame, floating over suburban churches and Weight Watchers meetings alike. Entire generations of women spent their lives hearing that hunger itself was suspicious, that wanting things too much, food, attention, pleasure, success, revealed weakness of character, and that the ideal Christian woman should occupy as little physical and emotional space as possible, while somehow still bringing an award-winning dessert to the church social. I have thoughts. Into this spiritually malnourished landscape walked Gwen Shamblin. Born in Memphis in 1955, Gwen studied dietetics and nutrition, eventually becoming a registered dietitian. But unlike traditional nutritionists preaching calorie charts and portion control, Gwen understood something more physiologically potent. People did not merely want to lose weight. They wanted absolution. They wanted someone to tell them that the humiliating cycle of binge eating, guilt, failed diets, and self-loathing actually had cosmic meaning. And Gwen had an answer. God. Or at least a version of God that seemed deeply invested in your waistline. In 1986, Gwen launched the Way Down Workshop, a Christian weight loss program that exploded across America with astonishing speed, partly because it arrived at the exact cultural moment when evangelical Christianity and diet culture were beginning to fuse into a terrifying smoothie of religious aspiration and body dysmorphia. And if you were not alive during this time, please don't tell me I'm exaggerating. The obsession with being rail thin, sickeningly thin in the 90s was all-consuming, and it's coming back. Gwen's message was deceptively simple. Overweight people were not suffering from biological complexity, emotional trauma, food addiction, poverty, stress, or the aggressively chemical nature of the modern American food supply. No. According to Gwen, they were suffering from misplaced worship. Food had become their idol, and if they simply loved God more than breadsticks, their life would transform. To millions of exhausted chronic dieters, this sounded not insane, but revolutionary. The genius of Gwen Shamblin was that she wrapped ordinary dieting inside spiritual language, transforming calorie restriction into holiness, while making failure feel not medical, but moral. If you regained weight, you had not merely failed a program, you had failed God, which, as motivational systems go, is admittedly quite effective, although perhaps not what Jesus had in mind while multiplying loaves and fishes. Her workshops spread through churches like gossip after an affair scandal. Soon there were thousands of Way Down classes operating nationwide inside fellowship halls filled with women clutching plastic cups of Crystal Light while discussing temptation in tones usually reserved for cocaine trafficking. Participants were instructed to eat only when physically hungry and stop when full, concepts which on paper sound reasonable enough until filtered through the intense moral framing Gwen attached to them. Food ceased to be food. It became a spiritual battleground, and Gwen herself became living proof of that system. As the years passed, her appearance transformed dramatically. The hair climbed higher, the makeup sharpened, the frame grew thinner and thinner until she appeared almost unreal on television broadcasts, all enormous eyes and lacquered blonde architecture, smiling with the intense focus of someone who had not consumed a carbohydrate since the Clinton administration. But audiences loved her, especially women, because Gwen spoke directly to a very specific kind of American misery, rarely acknowledged openly in church culture. The suffocating loneliness of women expected to hold together marriages, children, church obligations, appearances, and emotional stability while suppressing nearly every legitimate frustration they possessed. Boy, I was really letting my feelings out while I was writing this one. For many women, food becomes the only accessible comfort left. And with that comes weight gain. Gwen came along promising not just thinness, but transcendence. Former followers would later describe the intoxicating optimism of those years. The workshops felt exciting and supportive and helpful. Women complimented one another constantly. Pounds dropped off. Husbands noticed. Churches praised the program. Christian bookstores filled entire shelves with Gwen's materials. Her 1997 book, The Way Down Diet, became a bestseller, and the money started pouring in. By the late 1990s, Gwen Shamblin was no longer simply a dietitian. She was a brand, a celebrity, a spiritual entrepreneur who had built an empire from one of America's oldest fears, being seen as undisciplined. But success has a way of mutating people, especially when followers begin treating ordinary confidence like divine authority. And somewhere along the line, Gwen stopped behaving like a woman teaching weight loss and began behaving like someone who believed she had discovered a higher truth hidden from ordinary Christians. Former associates would later describe increasing paranoia, control, and grandiosity. Critics accused her theology of drifting outside mainstream Christianity, particularly over disputes involving the Trinity. The Trinity is not something I was raised with. If you're new here, I was born and raised Mormon. I left the church about 17 years ago. Mormons do not believe in the Trinity. Mormons believe that God, Jesus, and the Holy Ghost are three separate entities. Other Christians believe they are one and the same, the Trinity. And Gwen had some thoughts on the Trinity. Meanwhile, inside her growing inner circle, loyalty appeared to become increasingly important. And loyalty in high control groups is never free. It is purchased slowly, one compromise at a time. A missed meal here, a confession there, a little less contact with outsiders, a little more dependence on the group, always a little more fear. By the time Gwen founded Remnant Fellowship Church in Brentwood, Tennessee in 1999, she had already spent over a decade training followers to associate obedience with salvation and appetite with sin, which meant she possessed something extraordinarily powerful. A community of people psychologically conditioned to distrust their own instincts. We talk about this all the time when we examine cults. History shows that once a leader convinces followers their natural desires are dangerous, almost anything can become possible afterwards. By the late 1990s, Gwen Shamblin had achieved the rarest and most intoxicating form of American success. She had become rich while convincing people their suffering was spiritually meaningful, which is a business model so effective it has powered everything from medieval indulgences to modern wellness influencers selling powdered mushrooms for $89 a jar. But Gwen wanted more than success. She wanted performance. The problem with diet culture is that eventually people either gain the weight back, discover therapy, or become distracted by another woman on television promising eternal happiness through cauliflower pizza crust. I don't know. Religious authority, however, is much more durable. Religions survive scandals. Religions survive failed prophecies. Religions survive dead leaders. In many cases, religions become stronger after catastrophe because human beings are strangely committed to doubling down when reality embarrasses them publicly. Christianity pays, my friends. Maybe now more than ever. So in 1999, when Gwen founded Remnant Fellowship Church, she set up shop in an affluent Nashville suburb filled with sprawling homes, luxury SUVs, aggressive landscaping, and enough quiet social competition to make Versailles look emotionally regulated. And of course, Remnant did not look dangerous initially. The cults never do. The church appeared polished, energetic, and unusually disciplined compared to the sleepy suburban congregations that many members were leaving behind. Services were theatrical and emotionally charged, filled with music, testimonies, public celebrations, and attractive families dressed in crisp, coordinated clothing like they had all wandered out of a Ralph Lauren campaign sponsored by evangelical guilt. People hugged constantly. They smiled constantly. And they were very, very thin. Former members later described the atmosphere as magnetic. Many arrived during painful episodes in their lives: divorces and loneliness, eating disorders, family instability, grief, depression. And Remnant offered something incredibly seductive to vulnerable people: certainty. All cults offer certainty, and all villains have answers. Gwen projected total confidence in a culture where most people felt emotionally exhausted and spiritually confused. She did not speak like someone searching for answers. She spoke like someone who had personally received them from God and was frankly surprised everyone else was struggling to keep up. And for followers, that certainty is addictive because uncertainty is exhausting, especially for people raised in rigid religious environments where they're left questioning everything. At Remnant, life became startlingly simple. Obey God, obey leadership, lose weight, submit fully, and happiness will follow. Problems were not complicated systems involving psychology or trauma or finances or abuse. Problems existed because people resisted obedience, which sounds absurd until you remember millions of people secretly crave exactly this kind of worldview, because complexity is terrifying. Complex problems require ambiguity, patience, nuance, and the horrifying possibility that some suffering has no satisfying explanation at all. High control groups remove that discomfort by turning life into a cosmic vending machine. Insert obedience, receive blessings. And if blessings fail to arrive, clearly you have hidden rebellion somewhere. The church became increasingly insular over time. Social lives revolved around Remnant. Dating revolved around Remnant. Business relationships revolved around Remnant. Entire families became deeply embedded in the church ecosystem until leaving no longer meant merely switching congregations. Leaving threatened marriages and friendships and employment and housing, and in some cases, access to children. This is one reason that people remain in controlling cultish groups long after people think, just leave. Human beings are tribal creatures. Once every meaningful relationship in your life exists around a single structure, departure from that begins to feel psychologically similar to death. Believe me, I know. And then, of course, there was Gwen herself. By the early 2000s, her appearance had evolved into something almost operatic, as though a beauty pageant contestant, televangelist, and Tim Burton character had merged into one highly moisturized entity, powered by Diet Coke and absolute authority. The towering blonde hair became more elaborate every year, eventually reaching architectural dimensions that looked less styled than engineered. Former followers often still laugh nervously while describing the hair. The image was objectively bizarre, but partly because they had once treated this woman's approval like oxygen. I'm sure looking back on that now feels embarrassing. But Gwen's appearance mattered. It communicated success. And in American religious culture, charisma often functions as evidence of divine favor. Gwen understood that branding instinctively. The expensive clothes, the jewelry, makeup, and carefully curated image projected prosperity, discipline, and of course, superiority. She did not look like someone battling ordinary human weakness. She looked like she had conquered it. I mean, anybody that can wear this hair. Let me just go ahead and burn all my photos from the 80s. Meanwhile, critics were becoming increasingly alarmed. Theological disputes emerged after Gwen publicly rejected the traditional doctrine of the Trinity, placing her outside mainstream Christian orthodoxy. That's a whole story on its own. I'm just going to leave it at that. But religious leaders began denouncing her teachings. Christian bookstores began distancing themselves from Gwen. And as this happened, Gwen circled the wagons. Former members describe escalating control, humiliation rituals, and manipulation within church culture. But controversy only seemed to strengthen the devotion of the inner circle. You give people a common enemy, they will band together like nothing you've ever seen. And as we well know, once followers believe that criticism itself is persecution, every scandal becomes proof they are the righteous remnant standing against a corrupt world. One could probably convince people raccoons were agents of Satan if enough dramatic music played underneath the sermon, I swear. And inside Remnant, obedience appeared increasingly tied to every aspect of life. It got to the point where married members were told to report on each other. People who gained weight faced scrutiny and shame. Their physical appearance was tied to their worthiness. Children were expected to display exceptional obedience. These dramatic public confessions and accountability were normalized. This community did not operate under violence or cinematic brainwashing. It functioned through relentless social pressure, emotional dependency, fear of disappointing God, and the slow erosion of independent thought. Followers learned to monitor themselves, constantly questioning their motives and their appetites and their relationships until the church's worldview eventually replaced their own internal compass. And I think what's most telling of all to me that I remember from this time is that the people inside this cult church were constantly saying they were the happiest people on earth. The happiest people on earth don't go around telling everybody how happy they are. And that's on period. But something that I think outsiders often misunderstand about high control groups is that people do not usually stay because they are miserable every second. You know, there is some happiness there, and they stay because the environment delivers these intermittent, is that the right word? You know, you get these emotional rewards, and they're powerful enough to outweigh the fear and the exhaustion. There were weddings at Remnant that looked like fairy tales, massive celebrations, music and dancing, and really tight-knit friendships. Members describe feeling chosen and elite and spiritually superior to ordinary Christians. Remnant offered purity and certainty and purpose, a beautifully decorated answer to chaos. But underneath the polished image, something darker was beginning to emerge. Once a community becomes convinced that obedience is the highest virtue imaginable, compassion often starts quietly disappearing from the room. And when leaders are treated less like ordinary flawed humans and more like divine interpreters of reality itself, criticism becomes rebellion. Rebellion becomes sin. And eventually, even obvious warning signs can start looking holy. By the early 2000s, critics were already raising concerns about the church's increasingly rigid teachings, especially surrounding food and child rearing. And soon those concerns would collide with a case so horrifying it would force national attention onto Remnant Fellowship in a way Gwen Shamblin could no longer control. Every high control group eventually reaches the same terrible crossroads. At some point, the ideology has to leave the stage and enter the nursery, because it is one thing for adults to voluntarily surrender autonomy in exchange for certainty. You know, adults make complicated choices for complicated reasons. But when a movement begins shaping children, controlling their behavior, their speech, their bodies, their fear responses, the stakes become infinitely darker because children cannot meaningfully consent to ideological experiments conducted by emotionally unregulated adults who believe things like God personally endorses their parenting style. Got to keep the blood pressure down. By the early 2000s, there were louder and louder critics of Remnant Fellowship. They were alarmed by teachings surrounding obedience, submission, and corporal punishment. And you guys know I can't talk about abuse with kids without bawling. I'm going to touch on these subjects. I'm not going to go too deep into them because I just can't. Those of you that have been with me for a long time, you remember a couple of years ago, I sent TikTok into a frenzy when I talked about how strongly I disagree with hitting children. People like to call it spanking. You're hitting kids. I don't believe that we teach people not to hit by hitting. Just like I don't believe that we teach people not to do drugs by doing drugs. And I'm not perfect. My teenagers got a smack on the face a couple of times. I'm not proud of it, my worst moments, but I did not hit little children. Not that that excuses any sort of touching, but I cannot fathom striking a child. And to be clear, Gwen Shamblin and Remnant Fellowship have denied promoting abuse. Many members of the church They claim they're just supporting traditional biblical discipline. Because we should do everything exactly like they did it thousands of years ago. Pasteurization? Pfft. Antibiotics? Who needs them? Slavery? Sure. Hitting kids? Yeah, psychologically healthy. Critics describe a culture where obedience became elevated to a sacred status, particularly among children, who were expected to display behavior and discipline and obedience that is not childlike at all. When communities are obsessed with control, children become the proof that the way that they're living is right. If I can force this tiny developing soul to act exactly like I want it to act, then this is proof that I'm powerful. It's actually just the opposite. Power and strength come from letting another human being be free. These kids were expected to sit unnaturally still during long church services, obey immediately without questioning, and suppress ordinary childhood behavior that pediatricians will just tell you is called being alive. Crying, arguing, defiance, emotional outbursts, lots of energy. But inside authoritarian religious systems, the phrase breaking the will gets repeated with alarming enthusiasm by grown-ass adults. I had a major public embarrassment where I let go of my emotions on a person that said they were going to break a child's will. I didn't handle myself the best that I could have, but I'm not sorry for anything I said. Scrutiny around Remnant Fellowship emerged, mainly after the death of an 8-year-old boy named Josef Smith. Joseph died on October 8, 2003 in Atlanta, Georgia, and the details of his death horrified investigators. According to prosecutors, Joseph suffered prolonged abuse at the hands of his parents, Joseph and Sonia Smith, who were associated with Remnant Fellowship. Trial testimony described severe corporal punishment, confinement, starvation, and repeated beatings carried out using glue sticks, paint stirrers, and other objects. I could go into detail here. I'm not going to. It is absolutely horrific. These people went to trial, and at that trial, jurors heard evidence about the boy weighing only 36 pounds when he died. I had a cat that weighed 30 pounds. A second grader reduced to the size of a small toddler while adults around him discussed righteousness and obedience and still believed they were the moral center of the universe. Oh my gosh, I gotta calm down. The medical examiner determined that Joseph died from battered child syndrome. And suddenly, the carefully polished world of Remnant Fellowship collided headfirst with national outrage. Now, legally speaking, Gwen Shamblin, nobody from the church was charged. But prosecutors repeatedly referenced the parents' extreme religious beliefs tied to the church and disciplinary practices tied to the church to prove that this authoritarian parenting was dangerous. The trial itself, I remember it quite well, grim beyond description. Joseph had been isolated from other children and subjected to escalating punishments over very minor behaviors. He was forced to sit still for hours. He was deprived of food. I gotta stop there. And of course, Joseph and Sonia Smith didn't look like movie villains. They looked like respectable suburban church parents. People you'd see at a barbecue who might share a casserole with you when you're sick. And that contradiction always unsettles us because it destroys this comforting fantasy that evil always announces itself dramatically. A lot of times evil arrives carrying scripture. In 2007, both Joseph and Sonia Smith were convicted of murder and cruelty to children. They received life sentences plus additional prison time. And the damage surrounding Remnant's public image was spreading far beyond the courtroom. Former members began coming out and speaking more openly, and the stories were consistent. People described intense pressure to present perfect families. I know this pressure well. Some members say there had been physical punishment, and they escalated because parents feared appearing weak if their children behaved imperfectly. Others described a culture where women, especially, became trapped inside impossible standards of submission, beauty, thinness, and constant cheerful obedience that left them emotionally hollowed out beneath the polished exterior. Remnant did not merely sell righteousness, it sold a performance. A hyper-curated spiritual perfectionism where everyone smiled beautifully while privately unraveling like they were catching fire. If you went to one of the church events, it was music and celebration and lots of food everywhere that apparently nobody was eating. Expensive clothes, expensive cars. But underneath was a lot of human suffering and the exhausting pressure of constant self-monitoring. Were you thin enough, happy enough, loyal enough, submissive enough? And perhaps most dangerously, were your children obedient enough? Children are treated as visible proof of parental righteousness, and that is always wrong. A struggling child is not proof of any parental wrongdoing. It can be, but it's not instantly. Meanwhile, Gwen Shamblin remained at the center of it all, continuing to preach, to expand Remnant, and to project absolute confidence despite mounting criticism. Publicly, she dismissed many accusations as lies, spread by bitter former members and hostile media. Fake news, fake news. Whenever anybody says anything you don't like, just scream fake news. Followers defended her fiercely. To devoted members, outsiders simply could not understand what God was building. And to be fair, outsiders often struggle to understand why intelligent people remain in controversial religious movements at all. But the answer is painfully simple. People stayed there because Remnant gave them structure in a chaotic world. It gave insecure people certainty, lonely people community, unhappy marriages a script, women drowning in shame a promise they could become spiritually beautiful through obedience and self-denial. Former members described years of confusion after leaving, struggling to test their own instincts because they had spent so long outsourcing moral authority to leadership. That is the cost of high control environments. You stop hearing your own thoughts. And I remember by 2009, 2010, Remnant had become one of the most controversial churches in America. There were documentaries and investigative reports and lawsuits and defectors. But there was growing public fascination. Inside the church walls, Gwen Shamblin appeared untouchable, impossibly thin, extravagantly coiffed, endlessly smiling beneath towering blonde hair that increasingly resembled a separate religious entity ascending towards heaven on its own spiritual journey. And then somehow the story became even stranger because Gwen Shamblin was about to reinvent herself again, this time not merely as a diet prophet or church leader, but as part of a celebrity power couple straight out of a Christian reality show written during a fever dream. By the time Gwen Shamblin met actor Joe Lara, she was no longer merely a diet guru or controversial church founder. She had become something much stranger, a self-created religious aristocrat presiding over a kingdom of wealthy, disciplined followers in suburban Tennessee, while looking increasingly like she had been designed by a televangelist costume department operating under the influence of amphetamines and just unchecked confidence. And Joe Lara, for his part, seemed to arrive from an entirely different universe, which is fitting because their eventual marriage often felt less like normal human behavior, more like two side characters from wildly incompatible television shows. Before becoming known as Gwen Shamblin's husband, William Josef Lara had spent years orbiting Hollywood in the strange ecosystem occupied by B-list action actors, direct-to-video stars, and men who looked perpetually prepared to rescue someone from either a jungle or a low-budget hostage situation. Born in 1962 in San Diego, California, Joe Lara served in the National Air Force before pursuing acting, eventually landing the role most people would forever associate him with, Tarzan. In the television series Tarzan, The Epic Adventures, during the 1990s, he was Tarzan. He had the jawline for it, the hair for it, the vague man who probably owns several knives energy for it. And for a brief moment, Joe Lara occupied that deeply specific corner of celebrity reserved for actors your mother vaguely recognized from syndicated television, while we're folding our laundry. But by the late 2000s, his acting career had cooled considerably, and Gwen Shamblin's world was becoming isolated from mainstream evangelical culture, which made their eventual union fascinating to outsiders because it felt profoundly mismatched, but somehow inevitable. Of course, the controversial church leader with the skyscraper hair eventually married Tarzan. Duh! America is a nation built on spectacle, never more than now. Somewhere deep in the national subconscious, this pairing made perfect sense. Gwen had divorced her first husband, David Shamblin, after decades of marriage, a development that shocked many followers because Remnant preached strict obedience, marital hierarchy, and conservative family values. But those never apply to the leaders. Critics accused the church of hypocrisy. Critics questioned how Gwen's divorce aligned with her teachings. But we all know that inside cults, leaders exist under different rules than the followers. This is one of the oldest patterns in human history. Whether it's cult leaders or monarchs or tech billionaires or celebrity wellness gurus who survive on attention, charisma frequently creates a moral exemption clause around these powerful personalities. Followers learn to reinterpret contradictions as evidence of deeper wisdom rather than obvious hypocrisy. And soon, Gwen and Joe became inseparable. To supporters, their romance appeared to be joyful and divinely orchestrated. Church broadcasts and photographs presented them like evangelical royalty, glamorous, smiling, affectionate, perpetually bronzed, while the congregants looked on, those glowing expressions. To critics and outsiders, this unusual relationship just solidified the fears that the church was drifting further into a cult of personality. And there were people noticing that Gwen herself was changing dramatically. Her appearance became increasingly surreal to the point where even casual observers who knew nothing about Remnant became transfixed by her photographs. Her hair got higher and higher every year, sculpted into elaborate golden formations. Her makeup sharpened, and she just got so skinny. She had really heavy eyelids, and then she would wear these caterpillar lashes that just almost made it look like she didn't have eyes. And she wore these bejeweled gowns under dramatic stage lighting. The overall effect was somewhere between Southern pageant queen, prosperity gospel empress, and haunted Barbie doll. Okay, maybe your girl didn't take into account the double episode length with no air conditioning. I'm going to get a little sweaty and disheveled, but you'll forgive me, right? Gwen's followers treated her as though she were divine. And she looked like a woman attempting to transcend biology through sheer willpower and salon appointments. And Joe Lara stepped neatly into the role of protective leading man. Former members describe him as charismatic and charming, someone who blended naturally into Remnant's increasingly theatrical atmosphere. He joined the church productions, the music performances, and public appearances while becoming part of Gwen's inner circle of trusted leadership figures. Together, they projected glamour and certainty and romance and prosperity. Ooh, I don't know about the romance part. By the 2010s, Remnant Fellowship was no stranger to scandal. Former members continued speaking publicly about alleged control and manipulation and authoritarian practices. Documentaries and investigative reports painted deeply troubling portraits of life inside the church. There were family estrangements, fear-based obedience, emotional humiliation, and obsessive concern with image and submission. The church insulated itself from criticism internally. That is one of the defining features of high control systems. Control of information. Negative media coverage is reframed as persecution. Former members become bitter traitors. Outsiders become spiritually blind. The group learns to metabolize scandal as validation, which is an extraordinarily difficult psychological cycle to interrupt once it takes hold. And Gwen excelled at this. She possessed the polished confidence of someone who genuinely believed criticism existed because lesser people simply could not comprehend her spiritual brilliance. I mean, this is true narcissism. And I watched some old Remnant footage. It feels kind of oddly hypnotic, but very scary to me because I know women like this. I grew up with women like this, not at her scale or, level of celebrity, but these women who can shoot you a look and make you feel this big. And then, of course, there is the wealth, a great deal of wealth. Remnant's upper ranks increasingly reflected affluence, and church events often carried an atmosphere less reminiscent of humble worship and more like an upscale Southern wedding reception where everyone happened to be discussing salvation between bites of sugar-free cheesecake. Oh, the amounts of sugar-free cheesecake we ate in the 90s. I could probably build a castle with the Snackwell's boxes if I had saved them. Meanwhile, it was just all carbs and garbage. Members wore designer clothing. Lavish gatherings became common. Videos showed polished homes and vacations and celebrations, which again fits a recurring pattern in American religious history. Movements that begin by condemning worldly excess often eventually become obsessed with aesthetics because appearance itself becomes proof of divine favor. If God is blessing the righteous, then naturally the righteous should have a lot. I mean, I wouldn't know anything about that as an ex-Mormon, as my former church sits on trillions. It's supposedly $1 trillion now. Did you know that the Mormon Church is the largest privately held land owner in the country? Oh, but the church does a lot of good. By the Mormon Church's own accounting records, they have donated less than 0.01% of their wealth. That is by their own accounting. All right, I'm getting wound up. But this idea that even though the scriptures that Christians rely on say not to have wealth, that it's okay for churches to have wealth is mind-boggling to me. And underneath the spectacle, Gwen was providing something emotionally powerful: certainty in an era of increasing social instability. Her thinness signaled discipline. Suffering had meaning. It was clean and simple and terrifyingly seductive for some people, especially to people exhausted by modern life. And then came the aviation. This is kind of a new turn in the story. Joe Lara was an experienced pilot, and flying became part of the couple's lifestyle. Private travel projected success and freedom while reinforcing the elite atmosphere surrounding the church. The senior insiders often traveled together. Their inner circle appeared increasingly insulated. And they're jetting around the country now with Joe Lara flying the plane. And it would be Joe Lara as a pilot and his plane that ended everything. On May 29th, 2021, everything collapsed. That morning, a Cessna Citation carrying 7 people departed from Smyrna Airport near Nashville. On board were Gwen Shamblin Lara, Joe Lara, Brandon Hanna, Jennifer Martin, Jessica Walters, Jonathan Walters, and David Martin, several of the most visible figures within Remnant Fellowship leadership. Shortly after takeoff, the aircraft climbed unusually steeply before entering instability and plunging into Percy Priest Lake. Witnesses described the plane ascending dramatically, almost vertically at times, before suddenly descending. Then came impact. Recovery crews searched the lake for days, and suddenly the church that had spent years projecting divine certainty found itself facing one horrifying question: how could God's chosen inner circle vanish into the water in less than a minute? The crash dominated headlines nationwide because the imagery felt almost mythological. The glamorous religious leader, the actor husband, the wealthy inner circle, the private jet, the lake. It played like the ending of an HBO film about American spiritual excess, except for the devastating reality that real people had died violently inside that wreckage. In 2023, the National Transportation Safety Board concluded the probable cause of the crash was pilot error due to spatial disorientation during the climb. In plain English, Joe Lara became disoriented shortly after takeoff, and he lost control of the aircraft. And just like that, the kingdom lost its queen. But what happened next may have been even stranger, because instead of collapsing, Remnant Fellowship immediately began trying to preserve Gwen's authority, almost as though death itself were merely an administrative inconvenience. And inside the church, a battle over the future was only beginning. In the days after the crash, Remnant Fellowship moved quickly. Before investigators had even completed recovery operations in Percy Priest Lake, The church was attempting to stabilize itself publicly. For decades, Gwen Shamblin had not merely led Remnant Fellowship. She had been Remnant Fellowship. The church revolved around her image and her teachings, her hair, her authority, her approval. And now she was gone, along with much of her inner circle. The funerals became massive emotional spectacles, blending grief, pageantry, devotion, and the strange polished theatricality that had long defined remnant culture. There were elaborate video memorials and floral arrangements and soaring music and glowing tributes and near messianic language. There were speeches about her faith and her destiny, her spiritual warfare and her eternal victory. And the message from inside the church was essentially this: God is in control. The mission will continue and Remnant will survive. And standing at the center of that transition was Gwen's daughter, Elizabeth Hannah. Now remember, Gwen also has a son, Michael. Elizabeth Hannah immediately drew attention, both inside and outside the church. She had long occupied a visible role within Remnant's upper leadership structure, alongside her husband, Brandon Hannah, who had died in the crash. Elizabeth is blonde, polished, poised, and deeply embedded in the church's culture. She represented continuity. She spoke the language fluently, and she projected confidence publicly. Most importantly, she appeared fully committed to preserving her mother's legacy exactly as it existed before the crash. Michael Shamblin, however, occupied a more complicated position. To outsiders, the sibling dynamic soon began to resemble the opening act of a royal succession drama unfolding inside a highly aesthetized religious movement. But beneath the surface, the implications were serious. Succession is often the most vulnerable point in any religious movement. Once the founder dies, the illusion of inevitability dies with them. Followers begin asking questions they once suppressed. But perhaps most dangerously of all, the children of charismatic leaders eventually have to decide whether they truly believe the mythology they inherited. And publicly, Elizabeth appeared determined to continue her mother's movement. Remnant services continued, leadership structures remained intact, Gwen's image remained everywhere, almost hauntingly so, preserved in giant portraits, old videos, archived sermons, smiling photographs, and glowing tributes. Former members watching from afar described the atmosphere after the crash as eerie. It was almost too controlled, as though the grief itself had been placed on a strict behavioral management plan. And then came the documentaries. In 2021, HBO released The Way Down, God, Greed, and the Cult of Gwen Shamblin. I've seen it several times. And for the church, the timing could not have been worse. You know, it was bad. But the reason that I'm bringing you the story today is because I was scrolling on TikTok, as I always am, looking for stories to bring you, and Michael Shamblin came across my feed. There's war a-brewin', and the two siblings are at the center of it. What is going to come of it? I have no idea, but it's very interesting, and I wanted to bring this to you because I know not everyone goes deep diving on social media to find things like this to talk about. And Michael doesn't have a ton of followers. So when I saw these videos, I knew I wanted to talk about this.
He's finally ready to speak his truth. 20 years ago, would you ever have imagined that you and I would be sitting down talking like this?
Phil, 20 years ago, early on in Remnant, you were the devil.
The devil.
Oh, yes. You were Satan incarnate to the Remnant early on. Because, of course, Gwen was telling us all that. It did bother me.
That I was asking those kind of questions of your mother?
It did. To be completely honest, I was bothered.
You were pissed.
I was. And that was hard on me. But that's what makes it even more incredible now that I'm sitting here, have come full circle 180.
Who was the real Gwen Shamblin?
Gwen Shamblin Lara was a narcissist. She always had the answer. She knew more than anybody in the room, wherever she went.
And I notice you don't call her mom, you don't call her mother, you call her Gwen.
That's from habit. I quit calling her mother probably around 2010.
Why?
because we were so at odds. People have been hurt, fallen by the wayside, have been victim to it. People have been financially hurt by it. It's hard to call it a church in my mind. It is a church, but it's a cult.
You think it is a cult?
I do believe it's a cult.
Why do you say that?
Because it's a group of people who are devoted to a person, Gwen Shamblin Lara. I had spent so many years getting with abuse from some of these people that I never shed one tear. Not one. And to this day, I have never cried about it.
Not for your mother?
The people dying. Nope. Never cried for her.
Elizabeth continued to speak about expanding Remnant globally and carrying forward her mother's vision. But Michael was in the background of this, watching, drifting further away, and then eventually speaking. At first, his public comments appeared kind of measured and cautious. He didn't want to detonate his own childhood publicly. But over time, Michael's statements have become far more direct. In interviews with News Channel 5, he has openly referred to Remnant as a cult. Not controversial, not misguided. He has said the word cult. And because this was Gwen Shamblin's own son saying it, the impact was explosive. Michael described an environment of fear and control inside the church, alleging members worried constantly about punishment, social isolation, and retaliation if they even questioned leadership, let alone attempted to leave. And Michael also claims that the leadership of the church keeps files on people, maintaining deeply personal information about members. They're called guidance files inside the church. The church keeps counseling details, confessionals, photographs, recordings, and any sensitive material that could be used later on to pressure, intimidate, or blackmail followers. This is a big deal. This is why I wanted to talk about this. Now, of course, the church has denied allegations of manipulation and abuse, but former members are standing by Michael. His statements carry unusual emotional weight because he is not merely another outside critic or a former congregant. He is family. This makes everyone ask the question, what if the people closest to the throne saw something the congregation never could? Michael Shamblin has a lot to say, and I think he's only getting started. A second-generation battle over memory, power, fear, loyalty, and the ruins left behind is forming, and Michael Shamblin is not finished. By the time Michael Shamblin publicly called Remnant Fellowship a cult, the story had evolved into something far more volatile than a scandal surrounding a dead religious leader. Now it was a family civil war. For years, outsiders assumed that Gwen Shamblin's children would continue her legacy together after her death, presenting a united front as second-generation heirs to the Remnant Empire. Well, that did not happen. The fracture between Michael and Elizabeth increasingly became public and painful and impossible to ignore. Elizabeth Hannah has emerged as the continuation of institutional Remnant. She remains committed to carrying her mother's legacy on exactly as Gwen would have herself. The services have continued and the sermons have continued, and Gwen's image has remained everywhere. Michael has moved in the opposite direction entirely. And I think what makes his criticism so compelling is that he does not sound like a man angry at the church. He sounds like someone untangling his own nervous system in real time. Michael has described years of psychological pressure, fear, and emotional control within the church. He says members were conditioned to fear questioning the leadership, and they faced social annihilation if they left. He says the church encourages absolute loyalty and it isolates dissenters emotionally and spiritually. They get punished. And then, of course, you have this very troubling information about the guidance files, secret blackmail information being kept on people. And Michael's interviews hit differently. He grew up inside this machine. This was not an outsider, trying to decode what Remnant is about. This is Gwen Shamblin's own son, describing a culture that he claims is based in fear and image management and control. Of course, inside the church, Michael has become the devil. He's become the villain. Supporters of the church say that Michael is delving into sensationalism and dishonesty, and he's exploiting the tragedy. They claim Elizabeth is faithful and compassionate and unfairly targeted. I mean, it's really what's going on in this country right now. You know, you've got this group of people that are so fiercely defensive of someone that everyone can see is not okay. And everybody else is over here like, why is this still standing? Why can't we take this down? We've got all these people that are claiming they've been hurt by this, but we can't take this down. It's very, very timely for right now. But this church's survival depends on conformity and the image that they've always had. You know, Elizabeth looks like she's going to go forward and maintain that image. And Michael looks like he's trying to take it apart. The foundation is cracking underneath. And this church cannot afford ambiguity. These people need certainty, the kind that tells people exactly how to live, how to parent, how to eat, how to think, how to submit. And when the founder's own son is going against what she says, yeah, it's a mess. Michael is continuing to put out videos. I follow him and I see them from time to time. I go looking for them at other times. This thing is far from over. And I will keep you updated as the saga continues. Gwen Shamblin did not emerge from nowhere. She emerged from a country primed for her message. And even though it was in the 1990s, we've gone backwards to that time. We're experiencing this all over again in a different way, but the parallels are striking. Remnant Fellowship is more disturbing than a simple cult story because it reflects ordinary American anxieties pushed to their logical extreme. And now, years after Gwen's death, the church exists in a strange, suspended state. As for Michael and Elizabeth, public reconciliation appears distant at best. It's almost Machiavellian. One child is going to preserve the kingdom, the other is going to tear it apart by the machinery. The tragedy of Remnant Fellowship is not merely that people have been manipulated. It is that many were manipulated through their most human desires, to belong, to improve, to be loved, to finally feel good somewhere. And somewhere beneath all of the lawsuits now, and the documentaries and the allegations, and the family fractures, lies one final irony, almost too perfect for fiction. Gwen Shamblin built her empire teaching people to ignore their hunger. But hunger, emotional or otherwise, does not disappear when ignored. It waits and it grows. And eventually, if left unresolved long enough, hunger consumes everything around it. Well, I hope you enjoyed that deep dive. I'll bring these from time to time, although I will probably have to film them at different times of the year. I love you guys, and especially those of you that watch the entire episodes. Please hit the like button if you like the video. Subscribe to the channel if you want to see more from me. I think there's a lot of people that watch YouTube that don't understand how important that like button is, or maybe leaving a comment, just an emoji. Any sort of engagement is very helpful to the creator. And you know, I appreciate you so much. I'm so glad that you're here. I'm honored to be your friend. Stay safe, be kind to each other, and I will see you next time on Dark Hearts with Stacy Lee. Bye.